Hello and welcome to part 3 of what is affirmative action. If this is the first time you're tuning in, I recommend you go to my first video, which is where I define affirmative action and clarify what it is and what it is not. And then part 2, I talk about what college admissions processes actually look like, because a lot of people think they know what it means, and that's how they form their arguments about why they're against affirmative action, and they don't really. So in this video, I'm going to talk about what it looks like logistically speaking. When you're reviewing an application and you're using affirmative action, what does it look like? So we're going to start with 2 example applicants. These are both male applicants. They're applying to an undergraduate program. So let's go over how their applications differ. Applicant 1, higher GPA, also has 4 AP classes. AP classes are pretty important when you're applying, especially to competitive universities. They count for higher grades. They're seen as prepping you better for university courses. Applicant 2 has a lower GPA, still above the minimum threshold, 3.2, no AP classes. SAT scores, so out of 1,600, they have a 1,300. This applicant has 1,100. In terms of extracurriculars and leadership, this student was on the debate team all 4 years, also played lacrosse, and was captain of the lacrosse team. Applicant 2 has 1 year of student government, that's about it. They have their essays. This student has an excellent essay. This student has an average essay. And then they both have excellent recommendations. So if you're evaluating these applications holistically, meaning you're taking into account everything, typically it's using a rubric, and points, usually kind of arbitrarily, but they can be weighted differently, are used to score each section. So for all intents and purposes, let's say each category is out of 5 points. And so out of the 5 points, this student scores pretty high across the board. This student, much lower. So if you're gonna do the math, which I'm not, this application would score higher. So you're probably thinking, duh, let's admit applicant number 1. That's what I would think too. But we have to take into consideration the whole picture and the context of these applications, right? So if we're not doing affirmative action based off of ethnicity, you can still have these extras. So what I mean by extras are kind of those identifying factors that give us the whole picture of an applicant. Typically, you're going to include low SES. That refers to socioeconomic status. A low-income student is going to have more barriers, and they are underrepresented in college campuses. So they'll take into consideration if they are low SES. If you can use ethnicity, it'll be used. If not, they're also going to look if they're first-generation college students. Again, more barriers, less first-gen students on college campuses. These are often correlated, but not always. And then barriers. So barriers are things that are usually disclosed in personal statements. Maybe they had a learning disability, they had some sort of trauma that impacted their academics, they suffered from an illness themselves, so on and so forth. So again, even if ethnicity is not used, this kind of extra category is used. It could also include their gender, where it is allowed. Again, just looking at the whole picture. So based off of just these 2 categories, obviously applicant 1 is stronger. So let's go over hypothetical, what they have in each of these categories. So applicant 1 is not low SES. Applicant 2 is. Applicant 1's ethnicity is white, so this is a white male. This student is a black male. First generation college student. This applicant is not, this applicant is. And then barriers. So maybe there's something here like, I'm just gonna say LD, maybe a learning disability they disclosed. So whereas they maybe would have had a 4.0, they have a 3.8, maybe that explains it, maybe not. Barriers for this student. We could say housing insecurity, because this is not uncommon, right? They moved around a lot. They switched schools quite a bit, which makes it harder to perform well academically. They also are a single parent household. What I've seen firsthand from many of my students who are in low income or single parent households, they don't work just to have their own spending money, they work to help out their family. And so this student had to work, and not just a few hours a week, you know, 20 hours a week. That's a lot when you're a high school student. So let's say, again, each of these has a point value that you can assign to the categories. So sure, learning disability, a barrier, maybe they get a point for that. And then this student gets, I don't know, 4 points here. So in theory, affirmative action would take into consideration the context. They would get maybe 1 additional point here. They would get a few here. And that's to make up for discrepancies. We'll talk about what those discrepancies are in a moment. A couple things I want to point out about affirmative action. So we do have this general kind of category that most admissions processes use. Here's a couple things that are not talked about in affirmative action. Legacy status. This is the most pervasive and long-running piece of affirmative action in the United States. Legacy refers to if you have an immediate family member who attended and graduated from that school. What that usually means is money, because if your dad and your grandfather and his grandfather all went to your university, those are closer ties to the university, they're more likely to give money. So legacy status is often used. So let's say our friend here is a legacy. Now, because applicant 2 is the first in their family to go to college, they're not a legacy. So even if race is not used, legacy can be. Think back to the founding of this country. Who has had access to higher education? White males predominantly. You can have legacies that go back several generations in this country. And more often than not, they're going to be white, correct? So legacy impacts who gets admitted more than people recognize, and it is affirmative action, but not in the way that equals the playing field. Second thing I want to bring up, sports. If they play a sport, and this can be any sport, they can often get a little boost. Applicant 2 doesn't have sports. They worked a lot. They had housing insecurity, so they don't get points. Depending on the school, depending on the sport, it can compensate for several hundred points on the SAT. So he got a 1,300, not bad. Depending on the school, the extra boost he gets from sports could boost that up to almost a 1,600. What sports tend to do that? There was an article written, I think, by the Atlantic not too long ago that talked about these specific sports like rowing and lacrosse that have become more common among wealthy white students to boost their admissions chances. So again, this is what it would actually look like in practice for affirmative action. And these 2 ways are already benefiting those who more often than not have the privilege to be able to attend universities and be well qualified for them. So next, we're going to talk about the why. Why should this matter? Why can't we just look at these as apples to apples based off of their merit?